summary of the towns that I'm aware of that have adopted regulations for agritourism. It's certainly not a comprehensive study of every single town in the state of Connecticut that I'm aware of. It's a few towns that I'm aware of, but I know these are not drafts, they've been adopted. So one of the reasons I'm handing these out to you is that you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, okay? Other towns have already done it for you. So I'm handing that information out. The other information is a sort of a little, I developed this in anticipation of the Woodstock program, and what I called it is considerations when planning for agritourism on Connecticut farms. I will tell you, because it came from Joan Nichols at Connecticut Farm Bureau, it is not the Bible, okay? They're considerations. I'm not saying it's something you should do in your town. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that there are things that you could consider. Okay, so one of the things is when we're talking about agritourism, we're talking about activity that's added value or accessory to the primary occupation of that particular piece of real estate, which is farming. Okay, now therein lies the challenge. Okay, one of the questions, I'm working with a town in the center part of the state. They're grappling with what's a farm, what's agriculture, what's a farm. At what point is there enough activity to be called a farm? And therefore, if it's a farm, then can we then allow agritourism as an accessory use to the primary use, which is agriculture? Now, I'm going to back up to say, if somebody has a beautiful piece of property and they want to go down the road of doing some of these events or whatever they want to do, and it'll help them keep this land alive, but they're not really farming. That's for you in your communities to figure that out, okay? If you want to allow events on properties that are not necessarily farms. But what we're talking about here are activities that are directly related to where there's a farming operation, okay? So the first thing we always like to encourage communities to do is adopt the state definition of agriculture. And I'm not going to read it to you because it's fairly lengthy, but it's Connecticut General Statute 1-1Q. It defines agriculture, it defines farming, and in the middle of it, somewhere is the word farm. It actually defines what a farm is. You will notice in the state definition of agriculture, there is not the term agritourism. There has been some discussion over the years about amending the state definition of agriculture to include agritourism, but if you read the state definition that we currently have, it is clearly tied to production agriculture, okay? So there's a reluctance to add something to the state definition of agriculture that's not directly related to production, okay? So you won't find the definition of agritourism in the definition of farming and agriculture. But it's something, I don't know how your towns define farming and agriculture. Every town, some choose to adopt the state definition. It makes it easy. Others feel that they have to redefine what a farm and agriculture is. The other thing is, one of the questions that continues to come up is, how do we know it's a farm? I mean, to me, that would seem pretty obvious. You'll know it when you see it, okay? But what parameters do we use? At what point is there enough production going on out there to say it's a farm? Or at one point, in the example we're starting to use, is somebody grows 6 tomatoes, but they want to do 30 weddings a year. Is that a farm? I mean, I'm not being facetious, but where is the level of production there?
The tomatoes lose money, then it is.
You know, so, and I think you all know what I'm talking about, and that's why I want to open this up for discussion afterwards. So, we do have state statutes that could help you. One of them is Public Act 490, which is the criteria that your assessors use for whether a piece of property is going to meet criteria for the farmland classification. So in the factors to consider is gross income derived, amount of productivity going on there, contiguous, non-contiguous parcels. I don't want to turn this into a 490 presentation, but there are other statutes that you can start to look at. So if a piece of property is getting the 490 classification, then clearly it's meeting criteria for farming and for farmland, because if it wasn't, the assessor wouldn't be giving it the farmland classification, okay? That's just something you could utilize. Now, one town is dealing with, they do open space, PA 490 open space. Some of these properties or these landowners want to do agritourism, but they're on the PA 490 open space classification. Now you have to wonder, why aren't they in the farmland classification? You know, again, that's something we can open up for discussion. So that's something to think about. So I gave you some definitions here, and I did bring some 490 guides that go into far more detail. The other thing is, and all of the towns, I think there were 4 or 5 towns that I made a note in on that. And this is where sometimes people kind of want to throw rocks at me. You're tying the agritourism to an active working farm. So the other thing to think about is, should the farming operation cease to farm, or the farming becomes so diminished that it's down to the 6 tomatoes, okay, the right to do agritourism should also cease. Now, people will throw rocks at me for that, but we have had instances where the community says, okay, we're willing to buy into this. If this is going to help the town, we're willing to buy into this. We're willing to make this work. The neighbors, you got to convince the neighbors that it's okay to have 100 and something cars on weekends drive down the back roads and onto this piece of property. So the neighbors have to buy into this. 9 times out of 10, they'll buy into it because they want to support the farm. They love the farm. They don't want to lose the farm. However, when the farming diminishes but the activity continues, is that fair to your community? Is that what you bought into? So again, I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer to this. It's something to think about. But in the regulations that I passed around, I think 4 of the towns that adopted ag regulations specifically put in the regulation, should the activity, you know, the farming cease to exist, such does the right to do these activities, okay? Then, because then it just becomes an event space. Again, it's something to think about. Let's see. One of the things, you know, somebody said, well, you know, when it gets to the factors to consider, well, does the farmer get a farmer's tax exemption permit? You know, there's other tax programs out there where you could say, well, is this person really a farm? You know, at what point are they a farm business, okay? It's a farmer's tax exemption permit. I'm sure most planning and zoning commissions don't want to be chasing farmer's tax exemption permits and all that kind of thing. But there are other litmus tests out there as to whether the property or the owner is actually a farm. The other thing I want to bring to your attention, and we'll do that, I'll pass this around, and I gave you the resource at the bottom of the sheet here, University of Vermont, and at the end of tonight's program, if you have a Wi-Fi here, we can bring it up. University of Vermont Extension has a very, very, very robust website related to agritourism. And there's a lot of information on that website. I encourage you to take a look at. Of course, there are laws in Vermont that are entirely different than the laws in Connecticut. But one of the things that the Vermont looks at is they call it the 51% rule, whereby 51% of the property is used for production, or there's some level that they look at, whether it's gross receipts, whether it's production, but they call it the 51% rule. So clearly, again, better than 50% of what's going on out there, or the revenue coming in from the farm, is from farm production and not from the other activities. The other thing that came up is consider, and this is again open for discussion, I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer to this, but consider the length of time that the operation has been there. And where I'm going with this, how many of you are farmers in here? Okay, is it easy? If you're starting out, is it easy? Even harder, it's always hard, okay? One of the things that came up, Bowman Gear was the farmer in eastern Connecticut that came up to Woodstock. It's Gear's Christmas tree farm. They've been growing Christmas trees for generations, and they went into the agritourism. Apparently, if you have a hill on your farm that has a great view, It's a gold mine, okay? They had a hill. Everybody fell in love with the hill. It's actually where people used to park cars when they went to go get the Christmas trees. But anyhow, one of the things to look at is how long has that farm been in existence? We had this discussion in Woodstock, and for the most part, everybody agreed. If you have a new farmer, a brand new person, they just purchased the land, they're new to agriculture, or they're new to farming, and they not only want to start farming, but they want to do events and this other activity, all starting out at the same time, you have to wonder, have they sort of passed the litmus test that they're actually farming? Because farming is hard, right? And you could fail starting farming. Even the most experienced farmers can have some really, really bad years, okay? So do you want to take somebody that's never farmed before? Never. Now, I'm not talking that they farmed in New York or they farmed in Eastern Connecticut. They have a history of farming. They know what they're doing, and they buy a new piece of property in your town, and they're experienced, and you could find out what their background is. I'm talking about people that have never been in farming before, and they want to start the farm and start the events, everything at the same time, but you're tying this to production. If they fail on the production side, but you permit them on the agritourism side, again, are you doing your community any good doing that? So that's a challenge. One of the questions that came up in Woodstock was, well, you know, it was one of very experienced farmers from Eastern Connecticut, says, well, if I buy a new piece of property in Woodstock, even though I've been in Sterling for 3 generations, but I'm new to Woodstock, you know, would that hurt me? I'm like, come on. Everybody knows, you know, Econk Hill Turkey Farm in Sterling, and if you buy a piece of property in Woodstock and you say, I'm the Hermanot family, nobody's going to argue that you don't have experience farming. So that's something else to just think about. And then the other thing is, and this basically came from the regulations, all of the other things that you have to think about, the public safety, the sanitation, the noise, the permitting process, etc. So with that, I kind of gave you a lot of information. I'm happy to answer questions, or I'm thinking we should hear from the farmers and then maybe open